Good evening. Welcome to a Saturday night session of Cat Space. I'm Cat. This is Buckets and my friend, lifelong friend, Leon. Good evening. How are you? And happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you very much. Partner in crime, you could say.
Partner in crime. I like that one. So,
Uh, Without committing any crimes, of course.
of course. So tonight's topic, we are actually. What is that topic of mine? Oh yeah, over here. It's called time travel. So let's ask the first question, shall I? If you could travel back or forward in time, where would you go, how far, and why?
Hmm.
Who wants to start?
I'd probably go back in time to correct mistakes I made in the past.
What time period?
Oh, wow.
How far would you go?
That's a good question. I guess I would probably go back to my year 9 because I was like, or maybe, well, yeah, maybe year 9 or maybe the end of year 9 because at one stage at that point in my life, I hated high school. I was bullied by everybody. I didn't want to be there. Every time, it's just like to go to school, man, I would just hide away. I just would not go. I hated it. It was the worst experience of my life. From like year 9 to year 10, they were the worst experiences of my life.
So hang on.
Really, the worst experiences as far as school was concerned or whatever. But if I'd have changed it, I would have gone back in time just to fix that.
Why would you seriously go back to the worst year in your life?
So I could correct the mistakes that I made in that time.
Fair enough.
That way they wouldn't have happened.
I think for me, I definitely want to go back to the golden era. I think I would go
Golden
back.
era. How far back are you thinking?
I'm thinking maybe JFK era.
1960s.
Yeah, because I definitely want to, watching movies and listening to the music, and I definitely would like to be in JFK's era because one, living back then was definitely different, um, and it was more sort of a sort of exciting time period or exciting time in people's lives. I mean, the '60s were pretty much flower power.
And mini skirts.
And miniskirts and what's that concept called with the late
Woodstock.
Woodstock. I definitely want to see that. So yes, I think the 1960s. Where would you go?
I think for all the Beatles fans out there, I'd imagine they want to go back to 1967 or something like that. So that way John and Yoko never met.
I also want to see TV the way it was back then.
Well,
Black and white.
Black and white. Why would you? Okay, well, I'm not going to argue that. That's your call, not mine. I'd go back to the 1980s.
But then again, we used to have black and white TVs back in the 80s as well. So.
Oh, damn it. Why did you have to remind me of that?
Where would you want to go?
I would definitely go back to the 1980s because I just remember having so much fun as a child in the 1980s. Everyone just went to the beach and stuff. There wasn't any of this. The 1980s was very, very loose, particularly in Australia. So,
Oh yeah.
Even though we did have laws and stuff like that, we were kind of a loose kind of a generation. No one took anything too seriously.
Yeah.
So there was basically we had like I know we have computers today and stuff like that, but the thing is in movies having a computer was a bit of a fantasy almost. So this is where you got movies like Weird Science, how this one kid could basically create an entire woman out of his computer, even though there's no possible way you could basically do that from just a computer alone. But it was just a lot of fun, and it just seemed like one of those like the music, one of those eras where the music was fantastic, and the music was so good in the 80s that
Oh yeah.
that people are still using 80s tracks for their own music today.
Yeah, they are too. They're actually using 90s music as well for some of their tracks recently as well.
Next question. what's the advantage of living in this time period? I think the advantage of living in the 60s is you live through um, the way politics was run then, the way people lived. I mean, you had TV dinners, you had people would work, then you'd go like to a 50s diner, have lunch or dinner, you'd go to the, the drugstore or the cafe store where you'd have, you'd get yourself a milkshake and you'd eat ice cream
And
out of
it
those
was a milkshake.
you know you'd have sundays out of those glass sunday things,
Mm.
and everything would be
Oh,
bright,
yeah.
healthy and colorful, and cars were different, and then you had the lifestyle was different. People were always like going out to dances, and schools were different. I mean, schools were different compared to now.
Roller skating.
Roller skating, you know you had the
I was a
lifestyle.
beast at roller skating when I was a kid,
You had
especially at the
the
Forester Road roller skating rink back in the 80s.
you
I
had
was a beast at speed skating.
you had the fun of the 60s. You had different food then, you had a different world then, and you had people had different
Styrofoam
recipes.
containers from
Yeah,
McDonald's.
yeah, that those sort of things.
Bring that back, you environmentalist bastards. We want our styrofoam containers back so I can put my fillet of fish burger in it.
What advantage of living in this time period for you?
I look, I just remember how everything was kind of cheaper, and the notes
Yeah.
were different as well. So if you looked at in Australia, what kind of notes that we have,
Oh, yes.
basically the notes that we have are actually smaller. If you had a $50 note in the 80s, it was massive. It was and it actually felt like it was a big thing to carry around. I mean,
Yeah.
so that was one of the things that was really, really good. And like I just remember the footy cards that used to get in the 80s as well. I mean, you could probably
With
get
the chewing gum.
yeah, exactly, and I was totally obsessed with that. And I mean, I really, my favorite side was the Balmain Tigers back then, because West Tigers didn't exist, but you had Western Suburbs. But I just remember how you could literally get like a main face card of pretty much every club except the Balmain Tigers. It was like the Balmain Tigers.
The Tigers conspiracy. Here we go.
Everyone had Parramatta Eels.
Okay, but we're talking about the advantage of living in this time period. We're not talking about.
Well, it was, to me, I think the 80s was just a happier time. Everyone, no one stayed home, kind of thing. Well, they didn't. So most people went out, they went to the beach and stuff like that. And I do remember that if you did stay home, you'd watch things like Miami Vice, and you'd watch things
Hawaii
like
Five-O.
Yeah, that's another really good show. But you watched it with your family, kind of thing. These were family shows that you could watch together. And I remember I have 3 brothers, and we all used to basically watch the same shows together and still be entertained. And that was fantastic. And I also remember how both Neighbours and Home and Away came out in the 80s, and it was actually good, unlike now where it's terrible.
Yeah.
What about you, Leon?
Well, definitely the benefit today of these days would definitely be the technology. We're more technologically advanced than ever before. I mean, we are at a point now where NASA was in the 60s, so only in public domain. Growing up in the 80s, I was one of those people that would sit around the TV and watch Agro's Cartoon Connection. There you go. I'm name dropping an old favorite show of mine. I would watch big cartoons, and I would watch the football. Well, I didn't actually start watching football until the grand final 1989. Anyway, that's another story. But no, I definitely believe these days we're more technologically advanced, and also some technology is so much cheaper. Well, some of the technology that would have been used in the 80s is so much cheaper now than, well, quite frankly, it would have been in the 80s.
Now, here's where the next question ties into what you're saying. Good point. The time period for which you have chosen. What are the difficulties of your time period? And for me, I think back in the 60s, they didn't have things like internet or social media, Twitter or Facebook or Pinterest or whatever. You couldn't say how you were feeling, or you couldn't you couldn't say something about someone um, except to their face back then. You couldn't hide it. Nowadays in social media, you can hide everything you say unless you make it public knowledge for everyone to see. And they didn't have that advantage of social media. So everything was done by newspapers or announcements for newspapers or on the radio or TV.
Yep.
Or then, have next door neighbors who they love to gossip with. So they didn't have that advantage back then, I think, or difficulties back then.
Well, I actually remember is that virtually no one had, everyone had like a normal phone, the kind of phone that you basically plug into the wall.
The big cord phone.
Yeah, that's right. A big cord phone. No one had a cordless phone except if you were very, very rich. And even then that came more towards the 90s than
And it was very thick and very clunky as well. It didn't really work as good.
That's right. I mean, it was basically the size of a brick, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember that one of the things that cost the earth was STT phone calls. And you didn't, because no one
mobile calls, isn't it? Isn't that what you call mobile phones? Or no, STD, isn't that like standard area code, isn't it?
Yeah. So one of the things that you could, like, everyone had on them was basically they didn't have a mobile phone, but what they did have was a phone book. Everyone had their own phone.
Oh, yes. The old white pages, the old yellow pages, that thick, really thick book, which is about this thick. Oh, yeah.
So if you wanted
and there used to be 4 of them.
And so if you wanted to call someone, you actually had to go through white pages.
Yeah, exactly. Or you wrote your own phone book from the store. And I remember that my mum, and she still got it, by the way, has phone numbers that probably for the most part have phone numbers in them that probably don't even exist anymore. Probably 2/3 of the book no longer exist, purely because they would have needed an O2 or another area code or another digit, because most of the phone calls had 8 digits instead of 9. And that's just the way that you communicated. And I also remember that in the 80s, if you wanted codes for all your favorite video games, you actually literally had to guess them. The only way you could actually know is if one of your mates had basically hacked it. And there was none of this communication about how you could basically go faster or whatever. You basically had to work out everything yourself, kind of thing.
I used to have an old action replay cartridge for the Commodore 64, which basically covered all the games that I had. So all I had to do was flick a switch on the cartridge, and there you go. I played the game, and all of a sudden I'm right.
I also remember how easy pirating actually was. So a friend of mine, he used to put 2 VCRs together, because the thing is, Beta was probably better, technology, but VCR was a lot cheaper, and it was way easier to pirate VHSs than it was Beta. So I remember you could just, I probably shouldn't be describing how to commit a crime right now, but
No,
yes.
better not to.
Yeah, this is going on the Patreon edition. This
Okay,
part of it.
so why is this time period better than now? I think in the 60s, again, you had things like Woodstock. You had things like going out to dances, wearing those pretty clothes. You had going to the cafe to eat ice cream from those glass jars and milkshakes, and hanging out with your friends, going those 50 in those 60s cars, going to the beaches, playing board games at home. I mean, Computers weren't a thing back then, and neither was social media. So you could go across to your friend's house for lunches or dinners, have sleepovers. Schools were different. There were more
Oh
jobs. I
yeah.
think the job situation back then was much easier as well. People would hire you like that. When compared to now, you need to go online and wait for an answer and get rejected. To wait and get an interview. Back then, it was
And
like,
background checks.
yeah, back then it was like, you want
You want
to
to work?
you want to work? Here's a job.
Yeah.
Here's how much I'm going to pay you. And I think that's why that time period was better than now. What about you, Leon?
Well, for me, I did mention 90s was going to be the era that I was going to focus on. um, 90s, we did have the sleepovers. We did have computers or certain type of computers back then. I would just stay at a friend of mine's. We used to like he was now my friend, my longtime friend. I've been friends since I was about 5 years old. Apart from Donna, of course. There's really only two people I've known pretty much all my life. Donna is one of them, and another one of my mates was the other one. And what would happen is every week, say, I would go down to their place that lived not far away from where I lived at the time. And then any other week, they'll come over. And yeah, that's it. That's, as you said, well, manly sort of terms, sleepovers. I used to stay at my friend's place. My friend would come over here and stay over here. And we would watch TV, we'd play computer games and just laugh. And occasionally something that we did do, um, we would watch a show called Fast Forward. It used to be on Channel
Yes.
7. It
Yes,
used to be
yes.
it used to be a parody of parody shows and stuff like that. And we would parody their parody of their parodied shows and make it just as fun. That's something that we would do. We would grab Dad's old cassette player. There you go. There's another name drop for you, cassette player. We would be in the garage and we would just like make up our own skits of their skits, but with the cassette player. And that used to be so much fun.
What about you?
Well, one of the things I remember is that in the 80s, fireworks actually weren't banned. And you could, if you went to Canberra, you could pretty much buy whatever you wanted. You could even get it from Chinatown during the 80s. You could get whatever you wanted and basically set it off in your backyard. And legally, there's nothing anyone could do about it.
We used to do that.
And it was a lot of fun. And I just remember going to my aunt's house for Chinese New Year. And we, whilst having a Chinese New Year dinner where we would eat nothing but Chinese food and hot tea in the middle of summer, mind you, because it's winter in Hong Kong, we would let off fireworks. And that's something that we would do all the time. There's no way that you can even do that in Sydney now legally, except if you have a license. But
You have to do it in a controlled environment now and all that sort of garbage, sort of like red tape.
Yes, yes. So I just kind of, I just remember, it just used to be a happier time. And I also remember the type of shows that were on TV were just happier shows. There were more comedies on TV. Now there's so much drama. But back then you had shows like Growing Pains, Alf, Family Ties, those sorts
Kingswood Country.
Yeah.
Full House.
There you go. There's another name drop for you. Kingswood Country, which would never be allowed on TV these days.
Speaking of your time periods, what would you do for fun? As I said, I'd probably go to the milk bar or the cafe, and I'd have like an ice cream or a milkshake with my friends. I'd go dancing. I'd go to the drive-in movies. What about you?
Yeah, well, I remember actually, I'm not sure.
I'd go to concerts as well.
I think concerts were always kind of in for every generation. You can't really say that one generation had that over another. 80s, you certainly had a lot of concerts. My brothers would go to a lot of concerts in the 80s. I even remember when Midnight Oil played at the Opera House one time, and what was the other one that played as well was who was the one that came out of New Zealand and Australia? Crowded House.
Crowded House.
I remember when
there you go. Crowded House, baby.
Yeah, I remember when they played in the 80s at the Opera House. Um,
Right.
so that, I mean, that's going back, but you know, it was. I just think the '80s was just so much more fun than the other um, um, you know, decades. And you know what I actually do notice is that in Sydney in the '80s, um, it was okay to actually make friends with people. And unlike, say, today, where it's like, oh, no, no, you got to really, really be careful of other strangers and whatever. They would come out
Stranger
and
danger.
Yep.
with a stranger danger and all that,
Stranger danger.
you know, and not, like you don't know that someone could be kidnapped at the end of your street and stuff like that. We didn't have school shootings in the '80s. That just didn't happen.
We don't have school shootings today in Australia, do we?
No,
No, but
not
it
yet.
was the like the thought that, you know, a child could
I thought that could happen.
yeah, it just didn't exist, and that children still had their innocence. And I also remember basically going to the video arcade parlor
Ah, yes.
and just getting
Yes.
20-cent coins to constantly play games like Asteroids or Pac-Man, for example.
Oh,
Um,
God. Pac-Man, the game that never finishes.
yeah, pretty much, or Tetris. Remember that?
Oh,
You know,
I used to
so
play Tetris on the Game Boy until I flattened my cousin's battery. That's how long I was playing it for because I just couldn't get out.
Okay, next question.
But hang on, beforehand, as for me, right, with a friend of mine back in the 90s, we would go bike riding. There's one for you. We used to go bike riding because I used to live at St Mary's. We would just go to Whalen Reserve and do laps around that little reserve. It used to be like a driving area. I'm not sure if it's still there now, but what we would used to do, we used to go to Whalen Reserve and just ride our bikes just around the course a few times. That was one thing we'd do. Another thing that you mentioned, we would go to Time Zone because I think that's what you were trying to call it because that's what it was. It was Time Zone. We would go there and just play arcade games. We used to be able to complete games on only 40 cents because that's how good we were at the games. And that's how I learned my hand and eye coordination because of the Atari. Because I have had back in the 80s, I had no hand and eye coordination back then, and it was because of video games that I got that. And also, we would play sport, and like I said, we would watch TV, but mainly ride our bikes because we were really fit back then. Now we're really fat now.
see, my brothers were actually in skateboarding back in the '80s, and I think that
Ooh, the skate
skateboarding.
park's here now.
Well, the skate. I mean, I remember in the '80s. That's when skateboarding really took off.
Yep.
I mean, they've still got it now, but I just remember my brothers basically getting different colored sandpaper and stuff like that, and
Yes.
designing their boards. And they would have trucks like the size of your fist, unlike now where they have little tiny, you know, tiny wheels, which
Oh.
like, why are you bothering?
I miss the big wheels. Don't you miss the big wheels, man? I do.
Yeah.
I miss the big wheels on skateboards and roller skates. Those were the days.
Yeah.
Next question. Okay, here's a good fun question. What if you saw your previous self? What advice would you give yourself? I think back in the 60s, if I saw my previous self, I'd tell myself, hey, enjoy it while you're young, enjoy it while it's still here. Don't rush and do anything. Peace, love, baby. And live your truth and live your best life and just have fun with it and don't take anything too seriously and just be yourself. What about you?
I would have basically just said to myself, I know you're having a lot of fun, but invest in Apple now. You know, I actually know, to be truthful, I probably wouldn't
Invent something called cryptocurrency or whatever that stuff is.
Well, I would have
Bitcoin.
To be fair, I would have just said, look, stay being happy because there are going to be times in the '90s where you're going to be completely miserable. and just stay being happy, because happiness is the most important thing.
And I would have told my younger self to finish high school. Because I was an early school leaver and I regretted that ever since. But at the time, like I'd said at the start, I was bullied something bad. But if I'd have gone back in time, I would have told myself to finish high school.
Interesting. Next question. If you could bring back any item from that time period, what would it be and why? I think mine would have to be money, because money in the 60s was different to money now.
Wasn't
But
it pence, nickels, and all that sort of stuff back in the 60s?
yeah, I'll bring those, and I'll also bring a pair of clothing and shoes, because
Oh,
back then it
yes.
was different to now. And a magazine, maybe a Reader's Digest or something, a different magazine from that time period. What would you bring?
Okay, so back in the 80s, you had Alf toys. Do you remember?
Alf. I love Alf.
Yeah. So, but you had, how you had the stuffed Alf toy, and I was given
Oh, yeah.
an Alf toy. And back in the day, the Alf toys were actually put in an Alf box, right? That looked like a spaceship. Okay. And on Christmas Day, my younger brother sat in the cardboard Alf spaceship and broke the box. So if I was to go back in
no.
time, I would grab that box from him and make sure
Put it
that
on
he
top of the
was happy.
shelf.
And then bring
Oh,
it back
dear, oh, dear.
and have it on me, because I was absolutely devastated when he sat in that on Christmas Day. I was ready to murder him.
You can't say that. You can't say that.
No, I just said it. So.
You can't say that.
No,
Use a different word.
Oh, dear.
I was just a kid. I was 7 years of age.
Yeah, but you
It was a very impressionable. It was a very impressionable 7-year-old that was devastated because of a box.
I was.
You can't say the M word.
As for me, let's see. If I could bring one thing back in time, I reckon I would bring back my old Commodore 64, because that helped me like I said, that with the Atari. That and the Atari really helped me a lot. But the Commodore 64. I used to be a collector of the magazine. I think it was like Zap 64 or the Commodore magazine or something. They would have tapes, and they would have full games on the tapes, and you'd play them just to see how they go, or you play the demos and see how you go with them. But I would bring back the old Commodore 64, but because these days, imagine the sentimental value. But that was a big deal back in the 90s, obviously before like the PC came out. I think the PC started coming out around 95. And once that came out, that was pretty much the death knell of the Commodore. And then they got the Sega Master System, and then the Sony PlayStation, and Nintendo, Super NES, Game Boy, and all that sort of stuff came in because of the likes of the Commodore 64, and also because of the likes of the Atari. So if I was to bring one bit of item back from the 90s, I would bring back the Commodore 64, the original Commodore 64, because that ruled.
We actually used to have one of those. That was a great.
We had one too, Commodore 64.
Yeah, the old Commodore 64. So you guys could understand my saying I'd bring back the Commodore 64, because there used to be 3 ways you could play games on it. One was a disc, not a hard disk. One was a floppy disk. One was a cartridge, and the other one was a tape. There you go.
Next question. What would be your job? I think the 60s, any young kid or teenager or adult would be working in the supermarket. So I think my job would be supermarket cashier, because that was the main job going back then.
I would just, honestly, I'd work in a toy factory. That's what I'd do.
Oh, yes. I love you. Can you make me an Alf toy? Please?
Yes.
As for me, I would probably be in computer technical support or something. If it was me, I would be in computer technical support or computer repairing and stuff like that, because like I said, the 90s is when the PC came out. And my brother's really heavy into the computer stuff now, but I built my own computer. The computer that we use, the computer that I'm using right now, I saved up, I built all the parts, put all the parts in there myself, and got it running. So I would be in computer repairing for sure.
Awesome, awesome. Next question. What important event would you want to attend? I think for me, the biggest and most important event I would have wanted to attend in the 60s. Was he in the 60s? Maybe JFK.
Yeah, those 60s.
JFK's inauguration as president of the United States of America. I think I
Mm.
would have wanted to be there to witness that. To witness a great man in history who, was empathetic, who was, a great president, who had good policies, who shaped America. I think I'd definitely would have wanted to stand in line and vote for him and be at his inauguration. What about you?
I would love, speaking of politics, I would love to be at Bob Hawke's election when he became Prime Minister of Australia, and also the after party with it, because he got absolutely smashed. It was well documented as well. He was an avid alcoholic, but he was a great prime minister. He was a great prime minister. And I would have just loved to be at his after party when he won.
Well, as for me, when it comes to moments in 19, if I could have been at one, I would have gone to the 1991 NRL Grand Final. That was when the Penrith Panthers won their first premiership against the Canberra Raiders. Because what had happened, right, the previous year, and I was there in 1990 at High Street, Penrith, they'd actually did like a ticker take parade, obviously without having to purchase a ticket, but to line up and wish the Penrith Panthers well in the grand final against the Canberra Raiders back in 1990. So what they did is after they'd won the premiership that particular year in 1991, they had the ticker take parade thing after the grand final. So I would love to have gone to that grand final and watch it. But thankfully, the NRL, in their infinite wisdom, brought out the DVD of that grand final, so I get to take that out once in a while and just watch it and remember how good it was.
And lastly, what kind of clothing or style would you be wearing? I think for me, it would have to be bell bottoms with some sneakers and maybe a tie-dye shirt and a flower headband or something like that. Bigger earrings. I think that's what I would definitely be wearing. What about you?
I'd be wearing cords because apparently, even though I know that's totally out of fashion, but that was popular back then. You had cords back then in the 80s. Do you remember the cord pants that all the kids had? That was the end.
I think I remember that.
Every time you walked, you made a sound.
What about you, Leon?
Wow, I would have to really think about this. What clothing would I wear if I could bring it back? I'm just trying to remember because at one stage I won a ski jacket or something like that. It was at Parramatta West Point. I don't know what happened to it, but it was a beautiful thing. It was like greenish, light bluish, white. It was beautiful. I don't know whatever happened to it, but if I could have found that, I would have to remember what year it was when I got it, because I'd actually won that from a raffle and it was beautiful. I would have brought that back with me because that was great. That was one of my favorite bit of clothing to wear. It was just out of character for someone like me, and I loved it.
Wow. One last thing I do want to bring up because but I also have been thinking about this topic for a while. I definitely want to go forward in time because for me, I want to see what the future looks like. I want to see if cars are flying. I want to see if technology is different. I want to see if, just what lifestyle people are living, foods, parties, things like that. I definitely want to see how life will be and what kind of money we have. Just things like that. I've always wanted to see what life looks like ahead as well.
Well, with any luck, I mean, if something's popular enough, it could be used as a currency. Like, for example, do you remember those Pokemon cards? I mean, that was actually used as a currency for a while until the Japanese.
It was.
Yeah, until it was banned by the Japanese government. So if we could get like another version of that, perhaps, I can probably see it beating the US dollar.
In the 90s, at Mount Druitt, there used to be like a Pokemon swap meet, or I don't know if it was called a swap meet or not, but people would swap their Pokemon cards there at Mount Druitt. I would recognize this because I used to go to TAFE for Mount Druitt and I used to walk past it. So it's now, I believe it's now the car park for Mount Druitt Station, but that's where it used to be. It used to be a trade thing. And it also used to be Astro Cinemas as well.
Mm.
But yeah, I'd be curious to see what would happen in the future, see what's going on.
Well,
And
Underwater.
no, it doesn't.
yeah, how much is a bottle of water these days?
Yeah. It's about $5 now.
It'll be,
It used to be
it'll
free.
be more.
How much for this quart of milk? $20.
It'll be more. Well, that's it as of
Yeah,
tonight.
it would be more too.
Well, that's it as of tonight's time travel podcast. Thank you, Leon, for joining us. Unfortunately, he won't be with us next Saturday, but the following Saturday, hopefully, we've got a great topic for you, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you, Buckets.
Well, thank you.
Well, we'll see you later.
Bye. Oh, one more thing. If you could,
Oh, yep.
please,
Yeah,
go
if
on.
you could subscribe and
Right.
hit that notification bell.
that would be
Leave us a comment if you want to see any topics being spoken about. Invite your friends, and
if you do have a comment or an idea that you'd like us to talk about, and it's good enough, you could be in the running to actually win an award. Last week, Jordan Heath won the last award.
so we're going to be sending that to them.
So we're going to be sending that to them fairly soon. But if you've got an idea that we can use, you might just win another award as well.
And a shout out.
And a shout out, of course.
Thank you so much. Good night.
All right. Bye.
Bye.